Red Bull are now on the recovery path, entering a brand new era with Laurent Mekies and Red Bull powertrains coming in 2026. However, this team has experienced what can only be described as a collapse in terms of how political and chaotic it became. But how did things go so wrong so fast for a team which was dominating Formula 1 just a few seasons ago? When Red Bull and Honda united in 2019, it was one of the most pivotal moments for both organizations. Honda's reputation was instantly repaired after years of ridicule by McLaren and its drivers. And not only did they immediately win races with Red Bull, but when Max delivered that first win in Austria, I have always loved that the first thing he did walking onto the podium was point to the Honda badge. It was a brilliant gesture that repaired Honda's credibility, strengthened the bond between Red Bull and Honda, whilst also throwing some shade at McLaren. In terms of reliability and performance, compared to the 2010s when Honda were a major talking point for all of the wrong reasons, during their time with Red Bull, the best compliment that I can give them is that no one was really talking about them anymore, which is exactly what you want from your power unit manufacturer. Given the perfect start to their relationship and the subsequent success that they've gone on to have, in an ideal world, I think that Red Bull would have been happy to stay with Honda for probably the next decade. However, unfortunately, due to circumstances out of their control, their alliance was announced to come to an end in only their second season together. The problem with partnering with a major corporate entity is that you're basically a slave to boardroom decisions and geopolitics. Due to the pandemic and also the shift in focus to electrification by the company board, Honda announced that they would be leaving Formula 1 after the 2021 season. This was such a snap decision that kind of came from nowhere at the time. I mean, Red Bull Honda had only just started and started really well as a partnership. As a compromise, Red Bull were able to broker a deal in which they would now pay Honda to stay on as a technical partner until 2025. This allowed them to essentially still maintain all of the benefits of being a factory team, but from 2022 onwards, they would now be paying Honda for their power units, and the engine was also rebranded for the very first time as a Red Bull powertrain. The decision by Honda to randomly jump ship put Red Bull in a real bind, but it made even less sense when just 2 years later, after the 2026 engine regulations had been announced, with a bigger emphasis on synthetic fuels and increased electrification, they announced that they would return to Formula 1. To no one's surprise, Honda were quickly snapped up by Lawrence Stroll and Aston Martin, meaning essentially Aston Martin stole Honda away from Red Bull, and they would now become a fully fledged Honda Works team beginning in 2026, which is exactly what Red Bull were back in 2021. The problem for Red Bull is that during the time in between Honda pulling out and then announcing that they would return, they couldn't just stand still and do nothing. This was a championship-winning team that yet again found itself without a long-term power unit, and so that is why in 2022 they invested millions into building their own Red Bull powertrains facility in Milton Keynes. This, however, made it impossible to then reunite with Honda when they changed their mind, because not only did Honda already have a powertrains facility in Japan, but in the words of Max Verstappen, a few years ago they said, "We're going to stop." So then Red Bull set up its own engine division. Unfortunately, once you're already in the process of building a whole engine yourself, you can't really work together anymore. Red Bull got very unlucky with the timing of when Honda decided to pull out, because ironically, if you look at the success that they've then gone on to have, even with Honda being just a paid-for technical partner since 2022, and not only was Honda's decision pointless because they then went back on it, but there was also no real reason as to why the partnership had to end. The motivation for Red Bull to build their own engine division that could then be rebranded into a Porsche or Ford as it will become was to finally put the power unit into their control. It secures the team's long-term future, and it eliminates their dependence on manufacturers who potentially might jump ship on them again. The consequences, however, of Honda pulling out back in 2020 is that the brand new Red Bull Ford powertrain for 26 is a massive unknown. That in itself doesn't mean that it's going to be bad, and Red Bull have recruited a lot of experienced power unit engineers. But even so, this is still a totally unproven power unit. Right now the team is undoubtedly in a worse position going into their first ever year with their own power unit, as opposed to what they could have had, which is the consistency of a proven manufacturer, which is what they could have had if Honda never decided to pull out. Even when it comes to keeping Max, the power unit is also a worry there, because if the project is still too immature and looks like it's just going to take too long to become competitive, that's only going to drive Max out quicker to an established manufacturer like Mercedes. By far the biggest problem, however, that Red Bull have had is the brain drain that they have experienced, with numerous senior people that have been integral to the team for decades all deciding to leave in the last couple of years when, let's not forget, Red Bull had only just started to dominate Formula 1. Chief Engineering Officer Rob Marshall, legendary designer Adrian Newey, sporting director Jonathan Wheatley, Max's longtime #1 mechanic Lee Stevenson, chief strategist Will Courtney, and then the recent exodus of Christian Horner, as well as Director of Communications Paul Smith and Chief Marketing Officer Oliver Hughes, who were all fired for being close allies of Horner. Whilst Newey and Horner have been the names to dominate the headlines, in my opinion the most underrated change was actually Rob Marshall, because unlike Newey going to midfield project Aston Martin, Marshall went straight to direct rival McLaren. Something that underlines why I think this loss was underrated is actually the thoughts of Max, which I think are quite telling. When Marshall left Red Bull in mid-23, initially Max actually played it down, saying, "Well, I think a lot of people have made this very big, some media too." But in reality, he was no longer involved in the car we have now. And now those comments were made when Max was dominating the season. However, in 24, as McLaren became title contenders and as Red Bull started to regress, Max kind of backtracked a little bit and played up Marshall's impact on McLaren. Yeah, I do think he is making the difference there at McLaren. Once he joined, you could see that clearly. It's always impossible to pinpoint exactly how much each individual is responsible for the performance that we see, because Formula 1 by definition is a team sport. But I don't think that it's a coincidence that during the back end of 23, despite still dominating, we were already hearing that Max and Checo were not happy with the development direction, whilst over at McLaren, when Marshall joined in January 24, once he had a few months to get involved in the development of the car, McLaren delivered that season-altering upgrade in Miami that turned them into title contenders. Two people that have definitely not been shy to play up Marshall's impact have been Andrea Stella and Zach Brown, who have admitted that he has even exceeded their expectations. When it comes to what was the catalyst for all of these sudden departures, to me the death of Red Bull founder Dietrich Mateschitz was ground zero for what has now become a toxic and political environment. Dietrich had total control over the race team with no interference from either the Austrian or Thai side of the business. He was able to shield the team from any politics because he was always the man in charge. He gave Horner and Marco autonomy to run the team just as a pure race team with no one bothering them, but he also controlled them behind the scenes to make sure that they didn't get too big for their boots. In the wake of Dietrich's death, it created a power vacuum, and all of a sudden factions began to form because everyone wanted to have more influence and to have a bigger voice inside the organization. You had the corporate Austrian side, who now became the main decision makers. You had the majority Thai side flexing their muscles as well. You had Horner trying to consolidate his power by becoming CEO of the race team and powertrains division. And then you also had the Verstappen camp becoming more vocal than ever before, who were also politically aligned with Helmut Marko. Something that is very important to remember is that for almost 20 years Red Bull were the least corporate and least political team on the grid. And let's not forget that this team was branded as the party team. That was their appeal. It is exactly why the likes of Adrian Newey left Ron Dennis's very corporate McLaren and joined this energy drink startup in the first place, and it is also why so many of the people that work there had been there for years. Had Dietrich Mateschitz still been alive, there is no way that the likes of Jos Verstappen would be brave enough to be making public statements about how Horner would tear the team apart, because that is not how Dietrich liked to do business. Dietrich Mateschitz was very low-key, he never did really any interviews, and he also would have sorted these kind of issues behind the scenes, and not out in the public and in the media, where they have now damaged the reputation and credibility of the team. The point is that regardless of what fans think, the truth is that everyone has some level of culpability in the team collapsing in the way that it has. Horner, Marco, Jos, Max, as well as the Thai and Austrian shareholders. They have all created factions inside of the team, tried to increase their influence in the organization, enabled each other to be more vocal than they should be, and collectively have created a politically toxic environment that goes against everything Red Bull used to stand for, which in the end has driven people out of the team. Well, there you have it. If you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.